At 11:30 a.m. on January 16, 1942, Chief Aviation Machinist Mate Harold Dixon advanced the throttle of his Douglas TBD Devastator, watching the steel-gray Pacific stretch endlessly beneath his wings as USS Enterprise dwindled into the distance behind him. Dixon was 41 years old. He was an enlisted Navy pilot with 16 years of service, older than most aviators flying carrier missions that winter. This was supposed to be routine, a reconnaissance sweep 200 miles ahead of the task force, 3 hours out and back, eyes open for Japanese submarines prowling the carrier's path. He carried 2 men with him, men who trusted him absolutely to bring them home. The Imperial Japanese Navy dominated the Central Pacific by mid-January 1942. Submarines operated aggressively, surface raiders ranged freely, and American carriers were never more than a few hundred miles from enemy patrol lines. Dixon knew that. Every man flying from Enterprise knew it. He glanced at the fuel gauge. The Devastator burned roughly 85 gallons per hour. He had launched with 180 gallons aboard. The math was unforgiving, but manageable, if everything went exactly as planned. Behind him, in the rear cockpit, sat radioman 3rd Class Gene Aldrich, 22 years old, from Sun, Missouri, hands on the radio that would guide them back to the carrier. Beneath Dixon, stretched prone in the bombardier's position with his face pressed to the glass, lay Aviation Ordnance Man 2nd Class Tony Pastula, 24, from Youngstown, Ohio. The briefing had been simple. Scout northwest. Maintain radio silence. Return in 3 hours. Dixon had flown patrols like this dozens of times since Pearl Harbor. The TBD Devastator was already outdated, slow, heavy, vulnerable, but it was dependable. The Navy trusted it. Dixon trusted it. An hour into the patrol, something shifted. The wind changed. Dixon felt it immediately, not as a jolt, but as a slow, insidious pull. The aircraft began drifting south. He corrected, then corrected again. The Pacific offered no landmarks, no reference points, just endless water, layered clouds, and the occasional whitecap flashing beneath the sun. Aldrich broke radio silence. Static. He adjusted the frequency. More static. Either Enterprise had altered course more than expected, or the Devastator had drifted farther off track than Dixon realized. Either way, radio contact was gone. They were alone. The largest ocean on Earth surrounded them in every direction, and fuel was burning away at 85 gallons an hour. Dixon made his choice quickly. Turn east. Fly where the carrier should be. Lean the mixture. Find the most efficient altitude. Stretch every gallon. He checked the gauge again. Half full. Maybe 90 gallons. Just over an hour of flight time. Pastula's voice came up from the bombardier position. Contact. Horizon. Starboard. Dixon scanned the distance. Nothing. Just ocean. Pastula insisted. Dixon banked the Devastator. Still nothing. The fuel needle kept dropping. 70 gallons. 60. The sun climbed higher, merciless and bright. The Pacific remained empty. At 1:15 p.m., the engine coughed. Just once, but Dixon felt it through the control column. Then it coughed again. The gauge hovered near 15 gallons. Maybe 20 minutes left. No carrier. No land. No ships. Only water, stretching endlessly in all directions. The engine coughed a third time. Dixon did not hesitate. He ordered Aldrich to prepare the life raft. He told Pastula to gather every piece of survival gear they could carry. The Devastator had perhaps 10 minutes of fuel remaining. The nearest land lay more than 400 miles away. Beneath them, the Pacific dropped 3 miles straight down. Dixon began a controlled descent. If the aircraft broke apart on impact, they would sink with it. If it flipped, they would drown before the raft could be deployed. And if they survived the ditching, they would be adrift in enemy-controlled waters with no radio, no rescue coming, and the Japanese Navy hunting nearby. The Devastator dropped to 200 feet. 100. Dixon could now see individual waves. The sea was rougher than it had appeared from altitude, 4 to 5 foot swells rolling steadily beneath them. He leveled the aircraft at 50 feet, picked a gap between swells. Then he cut the engine. For 3 seconds, the bomber glided. Then the belly struck the Pacific. The impact hurled Aldrich forward into the radio set. Pastula slammed hard into the bomb sight. Dixon felt the controls stick tear from his hands as the Devastator skipped once, twice, then settled. The aircraft floated for 12 seconds. Dixon unbuckled and stood as water poured through the seams. Pastula shoved the yellow life raft package toward him. Dixon yanked the inflation cord. Nothing. He pulled again. The CO2 canister refused to fire. The left wing began to sink. Dixon stepped onto it, clutching the dead raft. The wing tilted, then slipped under. Dixon dropped chest deep into the Pacific. The water was cold, cold enough to steal his breath. Behind him, the Devastator's tail rose as if in slow motion. Aldrich and Pastula scrambled free just as the aircraft slipped beneath the surface and vanished. In less than 30 seconds, everything they owned disappeared into 3 miles of open ocean. The emergency radio, the flares, the rations, the water, all gone. Dixon floated in his life jacket, gripping the uninflated raft as Aldrich and Pastula treaded water nearby. The sun beat down. The swells lifted and dropped them like corks. Dixon found the canister again and pulled. This time, the raft inflated upside down. For 20 exhausting minutes, the 3 men fought the overturned raft as the ocean scattered them apart. Right side up, it would be 8 feet long and 4 feet wide. Upside down, it was nothing but slick rubber and resistance. Darkness was coming. Pastula tore off his shirt and tied it to the raft's perimeter line. Aldrich followed. Together they fashioned a crude rope, swam to the far side, braced themselves, and hauled. The raft rolled over with a slap loud enough to hear above the waves. One by one, they dragged themselves inside and collapsed. They were alive, but they were alone in the Pacific, without food, without water, without navigation, and without any way to signal for rescue. Dixon inventoried what remained. Aldrich still had his pocket knife. Pastula carried a police whistle. Dixon retained his .45 caliber service pistol with 3 magazines. They had rubber cement, pliers, 2 pneumatic life jackets. That was all. The sun dipped toward the horizon. Aldrich shivered despite the heat. Pastula stared silently at the empty water. None of them spoke. The raft measured 80 inches by 40. 3 grown men crammed into a space smaller than a mattress. Every wave slammed the rubber floor like a hammer. Spray washed over the sides. The temperature dropped. None of them slept. By dawn on January 17th, Dixon opened his eyes and saw nothing but ocean in every direction. The raft had drifted overnight, and somewhere beyond the horizon, survival had already become a long, brutal question. How far they had drifted, Dixon had no way of knowing. By dawn, the 3 men were soaked from constant spray, shivering despite the tropical latitude. Salt crusted their skin. Aldrich's lips were splitting, the cracks white and raw from repeated exposure to seawater. Pastula's face burned crimson, blistered from the sun that had beaten down on them the day before. Dixon understood the situation with brutal clarity. Enterprise would search, but blindly. The Devastator had been out of radio contact for more than 2 hours before ditching. No one aboard the carrier knew their last position. The search area would expand rapidly, measured in tens of thousands of square miles. And Enterprise could not linger. Japanese patrols hunted American carriers aggressively. At best, the ship would search for a day, possibly 2. Then it would move on. At 9:20 a.m., they heard it. Aircraft engines. Dixon looked up. A Navy dive bomber flew a slow search pattern half a mile to the north. All 3 men erupted into motion. They waved frantically. Pastula blew his police whistle until his chest seized. Aldrich tore off his white undershirt and spun it over his head. The aircraft flew on. It never altered course, never wavered. It vanished over the horizon. The pilot never saw them. The raft was yellow rubber on gray-blue water. From 500 feet up, it looked like flotsam, just another scrap riding the swells. Dixon understood then that aerial search offered almost no hope. Even a plane flying directly overhead might miss them entirely. The Navy would try again tomorrow. Then it would stop. Thirst became the enemy. A man can live weeks without food. Without water, 3 or 4 days at most. Salt water swallowed during the ditching had already accelerated dehydration. By mid-morning on the 17th, Dixon's tongue felt swollen, heavy in his mouth. Aldrich kept licking his lips, reopening the cracks. Pastula breathed through his mouth, each breath drying his throat further. The sun climbed. There was no shade. The raft absorbed heat and radiated it back at them. By noon, Dixon estimated the temperature inside had reached 110 degrees. They stripped down to their underwear. Within 2 hours, their shoulders and backs were badly burned. Late that afternoon, Dixon considered direction. Prevailing winds in the central Pacific blew east to west. If they surrendered to drift, they would eventually reach land. But Japanese held land, the Marshalls or the Gilberts. The alternative was steering south or east toward the Phoenix or Ellis Islands, still under Allied control. They had no oars, no sail. Dixon removed his shoes, heavy, stiff Navy-issue leather. He showed Aldrich and Pastula how to use them as makeshift paddles, pulling water toward the raft to create marginal thrust. After an hour, all three were gasping. Their arms shook with exhaustion. They had moved maybe 200 yards. At that pace, land was months away. Night fell again. Still no water. Aldrich lay staring upward, tracking stars he couldn't name. Pastula scanned the horizon for ships that did not exist. Dixon felt his mouth dry to the point where moving his tongue hurt. None of them slept. January 18th, 48 hours adrift. The sun returned and turned the raft into an oven once more. Dixon knew the body's timeline well. Kidneys would fail first. Confusion would follow. Then hallucinations. Then death. They had perhaps 36 hours before thirst became fatal. At 2 p.m., dark clouds rose on the eastern horizon. A storm. Storms meant rain. Rain meant water. But storms also meant danger. Waves that could flip the raft, winds that could tear it apart. The clouds advanced. The wind stiffened. Swells climbed from 4 feet to 6, then 8. At 4:15 p.m., the storm struck. Rain fell in sheets. All three men tilted their heads back and drank straight from the sky. Fresh water flooded their mouths, cold and clean, tasting like salvation. They had no containers, no way to store it. So they drank until their stomachs ached. 17 minutes later, it was over. The storm had saved them. It had also pushed them 50 miles farther from where Enterprise might still be searching. One of Dixon's shoes, their only steering aid, was ripped away and lost. That night, their stomachs held water for the first time in 2 days. They still had no food. They still had no direction. January 19th. 3 days adrift. The thirst returned with savage force. The rain had only delayed it. By mid-morning, Dixon noticed Aldrich staring at the water with a fixed, dangerous intensity. He knew the look. Salt water. Dixon warned him sharply. Drinking it would kill them faster than thirst. Salt would draw fluid from their cells, shut down the kidneys. Aldrich nodded, but his eyes kept returning to the ocean. Hunger joined the suffering. None of them had eaten since the morning of January 16th, over 70 hours. Dixon's stomach cramped constantly. Pastula swallowed repeatedly, his body trying to digest something that wasn't there. Then, near midday, the ocean changed. Fish appeared. A small school, 20 or 30, circling the raft, curious about the strange yellow object intruding into their world. They swam close enough to touch. Aldrich lunged. Missed. Again. Missed. The fish were quick. The men were slow. Aldrich pulled his pocket knife. He waited, arm trembling, blade just under the surface. A fish darted close. He struck. This time, the blade connected. The fish thrashed violently. Aldrich hauled it into the raft. Dixon crushed its skull with the pliers, then scaled it with the knife. They divided every edible scrap. Raw, uncooked, still warm. It was the best thing Dixon had ever tasted. The fish gave them ounces of flesh, but it gave them something more important. Proof. They could survive. January 20th. Still no rain. Their skin blistered and peeled. Dixon's back burned raw beneath flaking layers. Aldrich's face swelled. Pastula's lips split open and bled when he spoke. All three were visibly thinner now, ribs emerging. Then a shadow passed overhead. An albatross, huge, white, circling. It descended slowly and settled on the edge of the raft, folding its wings. 15 pounds of living meat. Aldrich raised the .45. One shot cracked across the ocean. The bird collapsed. They dragged it aboard and stripped feathers with shaking hands. The meat beneath was dark and heavy. They ate everything but bone and plume. The gunshot carried. January 21st. At dawn, shadows circled beneath the raft. Large ones. Bull sharks, 6 feet long, drawn by blood. They came closer. One of the sharks struck the raft. Dixon felt the impact travel up through the rubber floor, a dull, heavy thump beneath his feet. Seconds later, another hit followed, harder, more deliberate. The raft shuddered. All three men pulled their arms and legs inward, curling away from the edges. Aldrich made the decision instantly. If the sharks were going to investigate the raft, they would become food. He looped a cord from his life jacket around his wrist, bracing himself against the raft's edge. In his hand was the pocket knife, blade angled downward. A dark shape slid just beneath the surface. Aldrich struck. The knife drove into the shark's gills. The animal exploded into motion, thrashing violently. Aldrich held on as the raft lurched. Dixon and Pashula grabbed him and pulled with everything they had. The shark was 4 feet long, at least 60 pounds of muscle and teeth. It surged halfway into the raft before the blade tore free. The shark slid back into the water, leaving a widening trail of blood. Another shape circled closer. This time Aldrich was ready. He stabbed again. Same place, same angle. The knife sank deep. The shark convulsed but did not escape. All three men hauled it over the side. It thrashed in the bottom of the raft for 30 seconds, slamming against their legs, before Pashula crushed its skull with the pliers. Dixon cut the shark open with the knife. Inside was the liver, dark, dense, heavy with oil. They had all heard that shark liver carried nutrients. They ate it first. Then Dixon sliced the rest of the meat into strips. Raw, oily, difficult to chew. It sat heavily in their stomachs, but it was food. And food meant survival. In 5 days adrift, they had learned something essential. The ocean could kill them, but it could also sustain them. By January 23rd, the shark meat had restored some strength, but created a new danger. The dense, oily flesh intensified their thirst. Their bodies needed water to process the protein and fat. No rain had fallen since the 18th. 5 days without fresh water. Dixon noticed the warning signs. His urine had turned dark brown, severe dehydration. Aldrich had stopped urinating altogether. His kidneys were beginning to fail. They had no choice. They drank their own urine. Dixon went first, cupping his hands and forcing himself to swallow. The liquid was warm, bitter, foul, but it contained moisture and no salt. Aldrich and Pashula followed. The hydration was minimal, but it bought them time. Another day, maybe 2. The sun continued its punishment. By the 8th day, all three men suffered second-degree burns across their shoulders, backs, and legs. The burns split open, infected by constant saltwater spray. Dixon's back resembled raw meat. Any movement tore the wounds anew. At night, lying on their backs was impossible. Sleep vanished. The raft was too small for 3 men to rest at once. Waves slammed the rubber floor endlessly. By January 24th, Dixon estimated he had slept no more than 3 hours since the ditching. His mind began to fracture. He saw ships on the horizon that vanished when he focused. He heard aircraft engines that did not exist. January 25th, 9 days adrift. Another storm appeared, larger than the first. Black clouds piled high. Wind rose long before the rain arrived. Dixon issued orders calmly. He told Aldrich and Pashula to tie themselves to the raft using cords torn from their remaining clothes. If the raft flipped, separation meant death. The storm struck at 3 p.m. Winds reached 40 miles per hour. Swells climbed to 12 feet. Rain fell so hard it felt like gravel striking skin. The men drank desperately, swallowing until their stomachs were distended and painful. Water was life. But the storm was merciless. A wave lifted the raft 15 feet into the air and dropped it into a trough. The impact knocked Pashula unconscious. Another wave broke directly over them, dumping 200 pounds of seawater into the raft. They bailed with their hands, frantic, fighting the weight. 47 minutes later, the storm passed. The raft remained afloat. The men barely remained conscious. January 27th, 11 days adrift. Saltwater sores covered their hands and feet, open wounds that refused to heal. Every contact with seawater burned like acid. Aldrich's hands were so infected he could barely grip the knife. Weight loss accelerated. Dixon estimated he had lost 25 pounds. His belt no longer held his trousers. His ribs protruded sharply. Aldrich looked worse, skeletal, cheeks hollowed, eyes sunk deep into their sockets. Psychological strain eclipsed physical pain. 3 men in a space 80 inches by 40. No privacy, no silence, no escape. Every sound grated, every movement irritated. Dixon felt irrational anger when Aldrich cleared his throat. Pastula snapped at Dixon for shifting position. They were turning on each other. January 30th, 14 days adrift. 2 weeks in the raft. They had drifted roughly 400 miles, though Dixon could only sense it, not measure it. Currents carried them southwest. He tried reading the sun and stars, but without charts or instruments it was meaningless. Another bird landed, smaller this time. Pastula grabbed it with bare hands before it could escape. They killed it, plucked it, and ate it raw within minutes. The meat barely amounted to a few bites each. Still, protein. February 1st, 16 days adrift. More than 2 weeks without seeing another human face. The isolation became unbearable. Dixon found himself speaking aloud to the ocean, pleading, bargaining. He recognized the danger of it, but could not stop. The raft itself was failing now. Thin spots had worn into the rubber. Small leaks formed. They patched them with rubber cement. The supply was nearly gone. February 3rd, 18 days adrift. Time lost meaning. Only sun and darkness. Thirst and brief relief when rain fell. Dixon carved marks into the raft to track days, but even that system faltered. Hallucinations took hold. Aldrich saw mountains and beaches several times a day. Pastula heard voices calling from the water. Dixon saw his wife standing on the raft, perfectly real, before she vanished. They learned not to react. They simply nodded and stayed quiet. The body had turned inward. With almost no food, muscle tissue broke down to feed the brain and heart. Dixon's legs thinned to sticks. His shoulder blades jutted like wings. He could feel every rib beneath his skin. Digestion had ceased. There was nothing left to expel. February 5th, 20 days adrift. Infections spread unchecked. Aldrich's hands swelled grotesquely. Pastula's foot became so infected he could no longer stand. Dixon's back remained open and bleeding. Flies gathered during daylight. They laid eggs in the wounds. Every morning, the men removed maggots from each other's flesh. Then Dixon had a thought. Protein was protein. He ate several larvae. They were revolting, but harmless. The others waited. When he showed no ill effects, they followed. 5 calories, maybe. 5 was better than 0. February 7th. Another storm formed on the horizon, the third major one since the ditching. The ocean was not finished with them. This storm was worse than the others. Winds climbed close to 50 miles per hour, driving waves so large they lifted the raft nearly 20 feet into the air before slamming it down again. The impact stole breath and strength alike. Pastula was almost thrown over the side. His body rose with the raft and slid toward open water. Dixon lunged, caught him by the arm, and dragged him back just as the next wave broke over them. The storm raged for more than an hour. When it finally passed, all 3 men lay collapsed in the bottom of the raft, barely conscious, unable to speak, unable to move. By now, Dixon had begun to recognize a pattern. The storms came every 6 to 8 days. Always from the east, always in the afternoon, and always bringing rain. Those downpours were the only reason they were still alive. Without them, dehydration would have killed all 3 men before the 10th day. But each storm also carried them farther west, away from the island chains Dixon hoped they might reach. By February 9th, they had been adrift for 24 days. Nearly 4 weeks. The men no longer felt connected to their former lives. Dixon struggled to remember the shape of USS Enterprise. The idea of standing on steel instead of rubber seemed unreal, almost fictional. The raft had become their entire world. They had lived inside it so long they could no longer imagine existing anywhere else. Despair settled in quietly. Aldrich stopped speaking around February 8th. He lay flat on the raft's floor, staring at the sky without expression. Pastula talked constantly, murmuring about meals he once ate, places he once visited. Dixon tried to maintain order, small routines, simple rules, but discipline dissolved under exhaustion. The sun rose on February 10th. 25 days since the Devastator vanished beneath the Pacific. More than 3 weeks without rescue. No land. No rational reason to expect survival. The men were skeletal forms wrapped in burned, peeling skin. Their bodies were failing. Their minds were unraveling. Death no longer felt frightening. It felt inevitable. Then, that afternoon, something changed. The wind shifted. Instead of blowing from the east, it came from the north. The change was subtle, but Dixon felt it immediately. A north wind in this region meant a different current. That current could carry them toward the Phoenix Islands, or even the Ellis Islands. Both were inhabited. Both meant people, food, fresh water. Dixon said nothing. He did not want to offer hope that might prove false. But he began watching the horizon more carefully. He looked for birds. He watched the color of the water. He searched for anything that suggested the ocean might finally be ending. February 11th came. They caught another fish. February 12th brought rain. February 13th passed in calm seas. The struggle continued, but the wind held steady from the north. Dixon kept scanning the distance. Somewhere inside his failing body, hope tried to surface again. February 14th, 29 days adrift. Dixon woke to find Aldrich motionless. The radio man's breathing was shallow and uneven. His pulse barely registered. Infection had spread from his hands up his forearms. Red streaks ran from wrist to elbow, blood poisoning. Without antibiotics, Aldrich would be dead within days. Pashula was only marginally better. He could no longer stand, even while gripping the raft's edge. Weeks of starvation had wasted his legs. His left foot was grotesquely swollen from infection. When Dixon touched it, Pashula screamed. Dixon himself was failing. His kidneys were shutting down. He had not urinated in 2 days. His body was conserving energy, abandoning systems one by one to keep the brain and heart alive as long as possible. He estimated he had lost 40 pounds. From 175 pounds to perhaps 135. They were naked now. Clothing had rotted away or been torn into patches and cords. The sun had burned their skin black in places, raw and peeling in others. They resembled corpses that had not yet accepted death. February 15th. A bird appeared, not circling overhead, but sitting on the water 50 yards away. Dixon watched it dive repeatedly. Birds feeding this way meant shallow water. Shallow water meant reefs. Reefs meant land. He told no one. The others were too weak to understand, and he lacked the strength to explain. More birds followed. 1 became 3, then a dozen. They fed in the same area, diving again and again. The water beneath the raft shifted color, from deep blue to blue-green. Shallow. Dixon's heart rate climbed despite his exhaustion. Land was close. How close, he could not know. After 29 days of empty ocean, the idea felt unreal, another hallucination. February 16th. 30 days adrift. A full month. Aldrich regained consciousness at dawn, but could not speak. His tongue was swollen. His lips split so deeply they no longer moved. Pashula muttered about cornfields. Dixon was too weak to answer. In the afternoon, the sky darkened again. Another storm built, this one from the northeast. Winds reached 40 miles per hour. Rain fell in torrents. The men drank until they vomited, then drank again. The storm drove the raft violently southwest. When it cleared, the wind remained strong. The raft began moving faster. 3 to 4 miles per hour, by Dixon's estimate. In open ocean, the speed meant nothing. Near land, it meant everything. February 17th, day 31. Aldrich still lived, but did not respond. Pashula lay silent. Dixon's vision blurred. Dark spots drifted across his sight. His hearing dulled, as if submerged. Organ failure. Then Dixon noticed the waves. They were breaking differently, deflected, disrupted. He recognized the pattern instantly. Something was blocking them. Land. At 2 p.m. Aldrich spoke for the first time in days. His voice was barely sound. He said he saw corn. Dixon ignored it. Hallucinations had become routine. Then Aldrich spoke again. He said he saw green. Dixon lifted his head. At first, nothing. Then the raft crested a swell, and, for 1 second, he saw it. A thin green line on the horizon. Palm trees. Real. Solid. 5 miles away. The wind pushed toward the island, but also past it. The current carried the raft parallel to the shore. If they missed it, they would drift back into open ocean. After 31 days, they were about to lose their only chance. Dixon grabbed what remained of Pashula's shirt and dragged it through the water as a crude sea anchor. The resistance was slight, but it slowed them. The island grew closer. Palm trees became distinct. A beach appeared. Rocks along the shore came into focus. Then the reef emerged. White water crashed against jagged coral 50 yards ahead. The raft was moving too fast. If it struck the reef at this speed, the rubber would tear apart, and they would be thrown into the surf, too weak to swim. There was no way to stop. The current decided for them. At 4:30 p.m. on February 19, 1942, the raft struck the outer reef. The impact ripped a 6-inch tear through the rubber floor. Water surged in immediately. The raft sagged beneath their weight. Dixon reached down and hooked his arms beneath Aldrich's shoulders. Pastula, somehow still conscious, clung to the raft's edge as the waves lifted all three men and hurled them forward. The reef tried to tear the raft apart. Another wave broke over them and carried the raft clear of the sharpest coral, dumping it into the shallow lagoon beyond. The raft was sinking now, but it had done its job. Dixon's feet hit sand. Solid ground. For the first time in 33 days, he was standing on something that did not move. Water reached his waist. He dragged Aldrich forward, step by step. Pastula crawled beside them, using hands and knees, refusing to stop. The beach lay 30 yards ahead. Dixon took 10 steps. His legs collapsed. He fell face first into the water, pushed himself up, staggered forward another 5 steps, and went down again. The beach was closer now, 20 yards. Palm trees stood clearly in front of him. Not hallucinations. Real trunks. Real leaves. He pulled Aldrich forward another few feet. Pastula inched beside them, teeth clenched, body shaking. At 5:07 p.m., they reached the sand. Dixon collapsed and lost consciousness. When he woke, it was dark. Voices surrounded him, soft, unfamiliar, speaking a language he did not understand. Hands lifted him gently. He tried to resist, but there was nothing left in his body to fight with. Someone pressed a container to his lips. Fresh water. Not rain. Not droplets caught in desperation. Real water. The island was Puka Puka Atoll, part of the Cook Islands, administered by New Zealand. The islanders had seen the raft carried through the reef and came to investigate. What they found were 3 skeletal men barely clinging to life. They carried Dixon, Aldrich, and Pastula to the village. They fed them slowly and carefully. Too much food would have killed them. Their bodies could not handle sudden abundance after weeks of starvation. The numbers were staggering. They had drifted approximately 1,200 miles across the Pacific in 34 days. They survived on 2 birds, a handful of fish, 1 shark, rainwater, and their own urine. Together, they had lost more than 100 pounds of body weight. All 3 men suffered from severe infections, 2nd and 3rd-degree burns, and organ failure. Any one of those conditions should have been fatal. The village had a radio. New Zealand authorities were contacted. The message moved across the Pacific. The United States Navy received the report. On February 27th, a consolidated PBY Catalina seaplane from USS Swan landed inside the lagoon. Dixon, Aldrich, and Pastula were flown to American Samoa, then onward to Pearl Harbor for treatment. On March 18, 1942, aboard USS Enterprise, Admiral Chester Nimitz presented Harold Dixon with the Navy Cross. The citation cited extreme heroism, exceptional determination, resourcefulness, skilled seamanship, sound judgment, and leadership of the highest order. Gene Aldrich and Tony Pastula received presidential commendations for extraordinary courage, endurance, and strength of character. Dixon was commissioned later that year. He never flew another combat mission. He left active service in 1946 and retired from the Naval Reserve as a lieutenant in 1950. He died in San Diego in 1987 at age 85. Gene Aldrich returned to duty and survived the war. He died in 1973. Tony Pastula also returned to service and survived. He died in 1982. The raft that saved their lives was eventually sent to the United States Naval Academy Museum in Annapolis. It was later transferred to the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida, where it remains today. A piece of yellow rubber. A pocket knife. 34 days. 1,200 miles. 3 men who refused to die in the Pacific Ocean. If this story stayed with you, take a moment and let the algorithm know. Every like helps keep these stories alive. Subscribe if you want more forgotten chapters of naval history. Stories of airmen who survived with nothing but discipline, ingenuity, and the will to live. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. If someone in your family served, say their name. Because men like Dixon, Aldrich, and Pastula didn't survive, so they could be forgotten.